Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Governor John Carney, and we're here this morning for our fiscal year 2023 budget presentation. We do this every year. Normally, it's a press conference in person. Today, we're coming to you live streaming for purposes of being safe from COVID-19. Just at the top, I'd like to thank everybody for really leaning into mitigation efforts over the last several weeks. We're seeing positive developments, particularly at our hospitals. The hospital numbers are down and headed in the right direction, as are the number of positive cases and the percent positive on the testing. So thank you for your vigilance there. Thank you for putting your masks back on indoors. It really makes a difference and helps us with frankly, our budget by strengthening our economy, enabling businesses to get back to full speed, workers to go back to work in person, and you'll see the effects of that. We'll talk a little bit about that in each of the slides this morning. We will have a slide presentation. I'm joined by the Secretary of Finance, Rick Geisenberger. I appreciate the work of him and his team in developing our revenue estimates through the Delaware Economic and Financial Advisory Committee. They just do tremendous work. Rick will comment on tax policy and the state of our economy and some of the risks that are involved. Saran Cade is our director of the Office of Management and Budget. Thanks to his team and all the budget folks and cabinet secretaries in each of the agencies. Saran's going to really elaborate on some of the detail behind the presentation. I'm going to hit some of the highlights here at the beginning and as we move through. We also welcome Cheryl today, who's our sign language expert for the deaf and hard of hearing. Thank you, Cheryl, for being with us as well. You'll see today, you'll hear from us some of the things that I've talked about over the last 4 years in terms of being disciplined and responsible in our budgeting and looking to the future to make sure that increases that we're including in this budget or the prior year budgets are sustainable in the long term. We get our revenue estimates from the Delaware Economic and Financial Advisory Commission and build our budget based on that. The discipline is really imposed by an executive order that I signed early on in the administration, and we've modified since, which really puts additional discipline into the budgeting process and ties our operating budget spending increase to a target, a benchmark, we refer to it, that is established by DFAC. And so that's what guides us. It enables us to ride through the revenue ups and downs, and we'll show a slide that demonstrates that. It has enabled us to get through the downturn in revenues that we experienced as a result of the shutdowns of COVID-19, businesses not being operational. We lost a lot of revenue, as did many states. We were able to get through that without tax increases on the other end, service cuts or cuts in employees. And we're really positioned well now with strong reserves and the ability to do some improvements, particularly focused on our state employees and workers as we compete with the private sector for new employees to fill vacancies that we have. That is the biggest challenge that I hear from business owners across our state. We are experiencing it in state government as well. And our target to meet the obligations under the $15 minimum wage. And so we have a strong pay policy that's part of this budget that provides additional increases for those at the lower end of the pay scale, but increases for all state employees all the way through, and setting aside resources for our collective bargaining units and those contracts, as well as for our teachers and educators with the steps that they have built into their pay plan. So this is going to be a continued focus of ours over the next couple of years to improve our ability as a state government to be able to provide the services that are so necessary, particularly those that we've learned over the last 2 years are so critically important to keep our communities safe, to keep all of you safe during the situation in the pandemic. One of the other really important things going on is the the federal resources that we've received, and we'll highlight those in a minute. They've enabled us to respond to COVID-19, to support businesses, to make available testing, vaccinations, protection of workers and families across our state, with special focus on making sure more vulnerable populations were able to support our hospitals and frontline healthcare workers, as well as long-term care facilities and the vulnerable Delawareans that live in those facilities. We also should give a nod to our Delaware Army and Air National Guard. Will be able, with the federal funds, to build a new readiness center here out at the airport, which is obviously important for responding to future emergencies. Thanks go out to the Army and Air National Guard for everything they've been doing. Also, a special thanks and recognition to Senator Carper, Senator Coons, Congresswoman Blunt Rochester, and of course, our President Biden, with the approval of the federal funding, both the CARES Act funding that enabled us to respond to COVID, the ARPA funding, which is enabling us to invest in facilities challenges brought on by COVID, and then the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is a historic opportunity to meet transportation needs, large infrastructure projects across our state, including such things as broadband installation in the middle part of our state, Kent County and Sussex County. All those federal funds will enable us to really accelerate our economic growth, job creation as we move out of the pandemic situation. And obviously we'll see, we're already seeing that, and it'll enable us to make investments in important state facilities like the Home for the Chronically Ill there in Smyrna. So let's go to the slide presentation. The first slide, of course, we've received historic federal assistance and resources to fight COVID and to respond to it and strengthen our economy. It really comes in three large buckets. The CARES Act funding, which was just short of $100 million. I'm sorry, $1 billion. There's the CARES Act. All that money for COVID relief and response. Our Economic Security Act supporting workers and businesses. The American Rescue Plan Act, again, was our resources coming to states and local governments to help accelerate and strengthen the economy out of COVID. And then the bipartisan infrastructure law that we talked about. So let's look at the big buckets in each of these areas. First, in the CARES Act funding, we have just over $200 million that went into replenish the unemployment trust fund, and $200 million that was relief for small businesses. So both of those buckets really went to strengthen small business, to support small businesses, because without replenishing the unemployment trust fund, those funds would have to be replaced with a tax on small business at a time when they can least afford it. As I talk to business owners across our state, particularly those in those industries and sectors hardest hit, these resources, these federal resources, enabled them to stay in business, and that's critically important. About $200 million of the CARES Act funding went to our testing, contact tracing, and COVID response through public health. And then another $140 million went to child care assistance to keep our child care facilities open and running during the shutdowns that were necessary to respond to COVID-19. The American Rescue Plan Act, better known as ARPA, here are the big buckets. Again, $355 million for statewide technology and capital upgrades. I mentioned the Home for the Chronically Ill, HVAC improvements in our correctional facilities and state buildings, an opportunity to build a new lab for both our natural resources folks and for public health. Lots of important technology projects that enable us to respond and provide better services to the public. $135 million into housing development and emergency housing, really critical for very vulnerable populations on the margin there. And then I mentioned, as was the case with the CARES Act, $121 million to support our hospitals and healthcare facilities. Another $112 million for community recovery fund, capital projects for community service organizations. We have a whole list of applications for that and decisions being made on how to allocate those resources. Each of these buckets, there are tight criteria from the federal legislation that direct the kind of allocation that we can make here. With also we've announced $41 million for the University of Delaware, $33 million for each Delaware Tech and Delaware State University, again, facilities that are necessary for responses to COVID pandemic outbreaks, and then another $100 million for COVID response and $50 million for workforce development. The bipartisan infrastructure law, which obviously passed in a bipartisan measure, is federal relief and federal funding for transportation infrastructure and other infrastructure, really to be spent out over the next 5 years. So a little bit different than the CARES Act, which was spent pretty quickly, as well as ARPA funding, which has a 2 or 3 year limitation on allocation and the use of those funds. So here are the big buckets: $1.2 billion in federal highway money, again, over the 5-year capital improvement program. A really historic opportunity to make improvements and address clean water challenges up and down our state, with $355 million for water and wastewater projects. Again, many of these, if not most of these projects, are in the lower part of our state, and longstanding problems with clean water down in Sussex and Kent County. $225 million for bridge replacements and repairs, again, statewide, and a real opportunity to address public transit improvements and the electrification of our transportation network with recharging stations. $220 million there for public transit. And then I mentioned broadband infrastructure, particularly for Western Kent County and Sussex County. So moving on to our budget, we made it through the worst of the pandemic because we were responsible with our budget smoothing, targeting our operating budgets to a benchmark established by DFAC based on increases in median household income, population growth, those kinds of factors. And so we've been able to avoid tax increases and service cuts over the last couple of years. We'll talk about that on the next slide. You can see what the challenges that we face. The gold line is the percentage increase in revenues in a given year, and you can see the significant reduction in the growth of our revenues in FY20 and 21 as a result of the pandemic, and then the dramatic increase in FY22. So our spending benchmark enables us to strike a course in between the ups and downs in our revenue picture, and has enabled us to maintain a sustainable budget and to sustain the improvements in education, in higher education, in preschool education, in all the other services that the state provides. So here's what it looks like in the big picture. We've got the big blue in those pie charts is our operating budgets for FY 2022 and FY 2023, just short of $5 billion for FY 2023, the budget we're presenting today, with significant reserves and one-time, which is in the green pie, piece of the pie, and then savings, additional savings in the Budget Stabilization Act, again, part of the executive order that put in place budget smoothing. So we do have some tax policy, which Secretary Geisenberger is going to talk about, that are included in our budget to address legislation that's currently before the General Assembly. Secretary Geisenberger.
So the governor's, good morning, everyone. The governor's financial plan does include support for 4 pieces of legislation that are working their way through the General Assembly. This first one that you see is would exempt unemployment insurance that was benefits that were received in 2021 from taxation. And if you go down to the employer section, you'll see that this also prevents unemployment insurance tax increases on employers that may have, particularly those that were impacted by COVID, that would have seen significant increases in their rates due to higher experience factors with unemployment. The deposits that we made in the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund make that possible. It will also save new employers, because we've had such high unemployment rates in 2020 and 2021 from paying higher premiums. That bill, and we thank the General Assembly, is House Bill 285. It's already passed the House in January, and the Senate's going to consider that bill this afternoon. So we thank the members of the General Assembly for moving so quickly to get that enacted. The other three bills, the first one would double the volunteer firefighter tax credit from $500 to $1,000. The next bill would help us try to attract military retirees. A lot of times they retire in their 30s and 40s and 50s with tremendous skills that they've learned in the military, and we'd like them to stay in Delaware and create jobs, seek employment here in Delaware. And so this would increase the amount of their pension that would be exempt from taxation. And then the final bill is a bill that promotes making investments in the Delaware College Savings Plan and the Delaware ABLE Plan, which are savings that you set aside for your child's future college education, or for a disabled child to care for that child later in life. So this would provide a tax deduction for those types of contributions to the Delaware plan. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick, for going through the tax cuts, tax policy that's included in this budget. Again, responsive to legislation that's already before the General Assembly. Next slide shows the top line budget numbers. Again, an operating budget that's 4.6% operating budget growth, a little bit higher than the benchmark, really to meet the challenges that we're facing with higher pay increases for state employees, with the competition that we have with the private sector, and really, I guess, every employer in our state driving up wages to meet the limited supply of workers and the importance of services that we provide. Grant and aid there at $57 million. Our bond and capital improvements plan, I think the second largest capital program in the state history, just second only to last year, with almost $600 million of cash to the bond bill. Again, consistent with our budget smoothing executive order, and then putting additional money into the budget stabilization reserve in addition to the rainy day fund, just to have an additional cushion there given the uncertainty as we move forward. So our budget highlights and priorities continue to be the same. Really trying to strengthen the economy and invest in those things that enable us to be, as a state, more competitive, to bring jobs into our state, to enable businesses to hire again as we rebound from COVID-19 shutdowns, expanding opportunities for more people in our state, both with higher wages and with opportunities to get training and education necessary to be successful, and then supporting our families and workforce, particularly vulnerable families and workers that do critical service, provide critical service for the state of Delaware. So anticipated revenues, obviously this budget appropriates much less than that, targeted towards the DFAC benchmark. We fully fund the Budget Stabilization Act, and we allocate one-time money to one-time capital projects, almost $600 million in cash to the bond bill. So Director Cade's going to go over the highlights for the budget, and then I'll come back and talk a little bit about some of the priorities, the big spending priorities that address critical needs across our state. Director Cade.
Thank you, Governor. This budget, as the governor mentioned previously, focuses very heavily on compensation and pay policy and pay equity for state employees. Also includes significant pay increases for childcare workers and folks who are kind of on the front lines providing services throughout our state. This budget, you'll see, will increase opportunity funding investments for low income and English language learners, consistent with the governor's objective throughout the past 5 years. Continues investments in clean water, economic development, and fulfills a commitment to new school construction in all 3 counties. Completes funding to support secure and modern spaces for our Kent and Sussex County courthouses as we move toward fully funding those 2 projects.
So we know that good jobs solve a lot of problems, and that's why a major focus of mine as governor has been on working with the private sector, working with our General Assembly to create an environment where businesses can be successful. It's been particularly challenging over the last 2 years as we've tried to keep employees, workers, and the public safe, and with having various shutdowns. And so we continue to invest and provide tools for our Delaware Prosperity Partnership and the Division of Small Business in the Department of State, whose responsibility it is to create that environment where businesses can expand, hire Delawareans, and help Delawareans support their families. Here are the big buckets: $60 million overall for economic development, the strategic fund, $30 million. We have 2 funds that the legislature helped us create: the Site Readiness Fund and the Transportation Infrastructure Fund, which enable us to respond to proposals that businesses have, either to expand here an existing business, and we've had some real successes like Insight and Prelude Therapeutics, enabling them to grow here in Delaware and create jobs and add employment to their businesses and facilities here in our state, as well as bringing new employers to our state, like Wuxi ST Pharmaceuticals and their big pharmaceutical manufacturing facility plan for the Middletown area. Graduation lab space, we're trying to incentivize the development of science and technology companies at the Delaware Experimental Station, the former DuPont Experimental Station, multi-tenant experimental station now, including our partnership with University of Delaware and DuPont, the STAR campus, and other co-working and incubating spaces. This graduation lab space enables us to help companies stay in Delaware as they grow. Significant investments in our environment, in farmland and open space preservation, $30 million there. Really important work. One of the best farmland preservation programs in the country, and significant preservation of open space as well, thanks to the folks that do that job. Shoreline and waterway resiliency, we've got significant challenges as a low-lying state to meet sea rise, climate change, and these resources will enable us to do that. And then really the big game changer with $355 million of federal funding, and then additional state funding for the Clean Water Trust Fund, which will enable us to address really longstanding challenges, particularly in the lower part of our state with clean water problems. Secretary Cade mentioned school construction across our state in each of the counties, $339 million. We've been able to pre-fund some of those obligations, which will help us in the out years. But you can see the numbers there: $82 million in Newcastle County, $90 million in Kent County, and over $100 million in Sussex County, with additional resources set aside for bids that are coming in higher than expected, and additional resources for the Wilmington Learning Collaborative. We're really excited about the prospect there, working with Christina School District, Red Clay, and Brandywine School Districts, with additional focus on educating children in the city of Wilmington, and working together to do that with additional resources there. I've been spending a lot of my time knocking doors in neighborhoods across the city, talking to parents, talking to teachers. I was visiting yesterday Pulaski Elementary and the middle school on the west side, preparing for the new or for the rehabilitation of Byard on the west side. We're building a new elementary school on the east side and working with the community on that. It's really a highlight in the mayor's proposal to improve housing and make community development improvements on the east side as well. And so we're really excited about that opportunity. There is school construction happening across our state, and Director Cade is going to highlight some of those projects in each of our 3 counties.
Thank you, Governor. So looking at the slide, there's a large number of school construction projects that are underway, as well as in concept up and down the state in this budget. Take some very large steps to completing those projects. As you can see in Newcastle County, a large ticket item, there's a new Hodgson Votech in Appoquinimink. That $23 million includes the new Reading School, as well as a new elementary school, begins us on the track of getting a new elementary school for 800 plus students. Also, the Capital School District and Smyrna School District seeing a new middle school, as well as a new elementary school in the pipeline. Cesar Rodney with St. Thomas More, as well as the Milford Middle School coming in at large $37 million. Again, this doesn't fully fund these projects, but it gets us on a path to complete funding of them far ahead of schedule. We also see in Sussex County 2 new high schools, the new Sussex Tech, as well as the new Sussex Central and Indian River. So very large investments in school construction up and down our state. Next slide. As the governor mentioned, this budget continues the focus on low income and English language learners as we continue to fund the opportunity funding and set ourselves toward a goal of doubling that funding by 2025. The budget also sets aside $20.6 million toward mental health services for elementary school students as a result of the General Assembly passing HB 100 last year. Next slide. When dealing with our higher eds, we again have taken an opportunity to focus on addressing deferred maintenance at our 3 big college and university campuses, the University of Delaware and Delaware State University and Del Tech. We also set aside $15 million for the Higher Education Economic Development Fund. This budget also includes increase in expansion of scholarships for SEED, Inspire, as well as University of Delaware's First State Promise Scholarship for students with high needs. As you'll see as a consistent theme throughout this budget, we try to focus on compensation. Delaware Tech has established a compensation stabilization program over the last few years. And this is the second installment to assist them in competing for talent up and down our state. This budget also includes a Bachelor's of Education program and supporting it with $100,000 for Delaware Tech as well. And it's important to note the $107 million that the governor mentioned earlier in ARPA funding for our higher education and colleges and universities. Next slide. So again, there's been a large focus in the administration on transparency and policing and justice. This budget continues that focus by adding another $4 million toward the deployment of body-worn cameras and almost $400,000 to support our in-car camera program for law enforcement officers. This budget also includes $11.6 million to address safety and infrastructure needs at our correctional facilities in all 3 counties. Next slide. Again, when we talk about strengthening our communities, we can't do that without supporting our families. This budget includes $1.4 million to support extended postpartum Medicaid coverage. This budget expands the development of therapeutic foster care programs up and down our state to address juveniles with increased need. This budget also includes the expansion of the CHIP program for just under $1 million, as well as $3.7 million to increase the support of expungement programs as a result of legislation that's passed over the last few years. We also see, again, standing in alignment with our focus on therapeutic foster care, the expansions of our crisis bed units in Kent and Sussex County. Next slide. We again focus on our healthcare workers, constantly in competition throughout our region for high quality healthcare workers, and supporting our healthcare provider state loan program puts us in a closer, in a better space and being able to compete. This budget makes permanent the mental health services loan forgiveness program for Delaware State University, as well as University of Delaware, for individuals who are graduating with degrees in mental health and psychology and other mental health services. This budget also, again, staying in a consistent theme of focusing on supporting workers and trying to increase wages. This budget focuses $11.5 million to increase the support for childcare providers, as well as workers who have been on the front lines of this pandemic, supporting our children.
Yeah, so one of the biggest priorities of the budget this year is worker compensation and improving our ability to attract workers to our state. We have a lot of vacancies in each agency. Each one of the cabinet secretaries I talked to, I know the schools struggle to hire teachers. I was in a school just yesterday where they had significant vacancies. This is going to be a focus of ours, not just in this budget, but I'm sure in the next couple of years as well, as we try to move folks to increase and improve the pay scale for state workers, address educational pay as well. We have the focus the last couple of years has been on focusing on those in pay grade 1, those at the lowest end of the pay scale, and actually having pay policy that is more a lump sum, say $1,000 for each employee, as opposed to a percentage increase. This year, we take a little bit different approach in raising and improving the pay scale itself. And so you have large increases at the bottom of the pay scale, larger increases than we've been able to do at the middle of the pay scale, and all the way through to the top, trying to provide additional resources to compete with the private sector. This is going to be a focus of ours. We've got pay increases that range from a high at the very bottom of 9% to 2% at the top, and with an average there more than we've been able to do the last couple of years. We are still continuing the pace to hit the $15 minimum wage that was established by the legislature for the private sector here in our state, and we're making steady progress there. Not quite there yet, but getting there. And we have a one-time bonus for state retirees, obviously funding negotiated contracts with those that we bargain with collectively, and fully fund the pay scales and provide 2% for our educators. Saran, you want to talk more about that, or move on to the other capital slides there?
We're going to move on to the capital slides. So just in summation, we'll go over some top line numbers. $305 million, as we mentioned, for school construction as we improve schools for Delaware students and keep up with population growth. Governor mentioned before, continued focus on small business and infrastructure and economic development and providing opportunity. The strategic fund helps us in doing that, so we recommend another $30 million for that. Next slide. Obviously, high ticket items that you see here is an increased focus on our libraries, obviously anchors in our communities. This will be companion funding that will be coming from ARP as well. So this state dollars will go to leverage some other ARP funds to allow us really to invest in these anchors throughout up and down our state. Also, you see $21 million for preserving our historical and recreational sites. So our Brandywine Zoo, John Dickinson Plantation, Cooch's Bridge, and other tourist destinations and locations that Delawareans travel to for education and relaxation. Also, looking at protecting our natural resources for future generations. The governor mentioned major investments in clean water and drinking water programs, over $355 million in federal funding and also other state funds as well, and $30 million in ag land preservation and open space. Next slide. We mentioned before continued focus on funding our Kent and Sussex County courthouse projects. We're looking at the start of the Sussex County courthouse construction being the middle of this year, sometime in the spring, and Kent County being at the end of the year. This budget also includes new Delaware State Police Troops 4 and 6, as well as a continued investment in the Customs House in Newcastle County and City of Wilmington. Also looking at building a strong foundation for our state, investing in our state facilities that the public visits daily for services has been a major focus of the administration as well. Next slide, Governor. So again, hitting on these top line numbers, $4.9 billion but operating budget, just about 4.6% growth, $56.9 million in grant and aid, nearly a $1.2 billion capital improvements bond bill, which includes $591 million in cash to the bond bill, as well as $215 million in one-times for technology upgrades and healthcare for state workers. This budget also sets aside $15 million to continue the effort of fully funding the Budget Stabilization Fund for cash savings and the continued responsible outlook on future financial planning. Next slide.
So this, thank you, Secretary Cade. This slide lays out the schedule for our budget process. Obviously, we're here in January, where each year the governor submits his recommended budget to the General Assembly. This is my recommended budget for FY 2023. Prior to today, our cabinet secretaries have been working with their agency leaders in developing the budget through the summer and the fall. Our budget office has had hearings with each of those agencies. We've worked with federal agencies in understanding the significant resources provided by the federal government. Again, thanks go out to Senator Carper, Senator Coons, Congresswoman Blunt Rochester, and President Biden for those resources, which will really help us both in this budget and in strengthening our economy and supporting families and workers as we work our way out of COVID-19. Joint Finance Committee will have hearings now, and the Bond Bill Committee through the rest of the winter and spring, leading up to a markup of the budget with changes that the General Assembly will include in April and May, and a final approval expected by June 30th. And so I want to thank again all those who were instrumental in putting this together, getting us to this place. And I would ask Rick I know we have a couple DFAC meetings coming up, Delaware Economic and Financial Advisory Committee, which will fine-tune the revenue estimate on which the final budget needs to be based and approved by the General Assembly. If you could give us a little summary of the thinking of the DFAC and where we are. You've got a couple meetings left, I know. If you could just comment on those,
Sure.
on the thinking of the committee.
Sure. As DFAC meets over the next 5 months or so, the things that are top of mind on the expenditure side is inflation. Last year, inflation was at its highest level since 1990. If you look at the last couple of months, inflation's been at the highest level since 1980. It was 1990 last year. Wage pressures. The governor mentioned wage pressure in the private sector, public sector too. Wage growth has been the highest level since 1949. I don't think any of the three of us remember 1949. We're around in 1949. So there's concern about that. And the reason we have this big spike in revenue is frankly due to three sources. They happen to be our three most volatile revenue sources: the corporate income tax, the realty transfer tax, which is driven by real estate and home sales and interest rates, and then estimated personal income tax payments, which are largely driven by capital gains and the stock market. All three of those revenue sources have been growing over the last 2 years at 4 times the rate of what they had been growing in the 10 years prior. So what we've seen historically, and what we'll be keeping a close eye on, is that when that happens, we tend to see a drop off. Sometimes that drop off in those revenue categories is as much as 30 to 45%, which inserts anywhere from $500 to $600 million of downside risk. So all of those things, inflation, wages, the volatility of our revenues, are why this budget's been constructed to try to be cautious in terms of how much operating budget growth we build, also cautious around what we do in terms of long-term tax policy.
So thank you very much, Secretary Geisenberger. So we have followed kind of the budget smoothing principles, trying to chart a course in between the highs and lows of the revenue that we receive from taxpayers over the last several years, that has served us well and successfully during the downturn as a result of COVID-19. And in order to maintain these improvements, both in terms of worker salaries, in terms of investments in education, support for families, or early child care, we need to continue to chart that cautious course going forward. There is significant downside risk, as Rick mentioned, on the order of $250 to $500 million, and so we're going to continue to be responsible with this proposal, working with the General Assembly. We appreciate their cooperation over the last couple of years in adopting these principles, which will serve Delaware taxpayers well, both today and in the future, and enable us to make the kinds of investments necessary so our children can be successful in school, grow up to be successful in life, so we can have a strong and growing economy that supports all Delawareans, and that we can address the needs of vulnerable populations across our state. So just finally, thanks once again to Director Cade and his team at OMB, Secretary Geisenberger and his team establishing the revenue estimates, everybody involved in the preparation of this budget. And we look forward to working with you, the public, in responding to questions and concerns, as well as to the General Assembly, who make the final decisions on the disposition of this budget. So thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to the approval of the FY 2023 budget at the end of June.